Thank you for joining Cancer Support Community Atlanta for this program. Please visit our website, cscatlanta.org, for a complete list of live and recorded events. We invite you to sign up for our newsletter to stay connected to all future programs.
So, as I mentioned last week, we discussed the overview of cancer prevention and recurrence guidelines brought to us by the American Institute of Cancer Research. Today, we're going to focus on embracing a plant-based diet, and then to next for a session on how to evaluate nutrition-related research, as well as get some wonderful resources to kind of help you as you continue on your nutrition journey. And then lastly, in the last week of the month, we are going to talk about how long-term treatment specifically for our survivors, keeping in mind our goal of preventing cancer recurrence. So just to one session, automatically register Atlanta.org website and register for the ones that you want to come and join us for individually. So just a little tip there. All right. So last week we issued a challenge to figure out a way that we could start implementing some of those recommendations in the American Institute of Cancer Research. So since we got started a little bit later, what I'm going to have y'all do is if you participated in one of these challenge activities, if you want to pop it in the chat, and in the end, we can kind of, when we do question time, we'll kind of look through those and share our successes and our experiences with that. But I hope you had fun. All right. So today, what we're going to do is we're briefly going to review those cancer prevention recommendations from the AICR. And we're going to talk about what a plant-based diet is and define the different types of plant-based diets. Then we'll start talking about some steps for how to get started. So what does this actually look like for us as individuals? And I'll throw out some tips and some guidelines to help you implement a plant-based lifestyle through meal planning. Okay, so let's do a little review from last week. So there are quite a few recommendations that you'll notice are really highlighting today. So first of all, one of the top things we can do for reducing cancer risk is work towards maintaining a healthy body weight and also being physically active. And part of that incorporates eating a diet rich in a lot of whole, minimally processed plant foods, so our whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and legumes, while also limiting consumption of fast foods and other foods high in fats, starches, and added sugars. We also want to limit consumption of red and processed meats. So all of those tips, those guidelines can really be summed up into following more of a plant-based, or as you'll hear me say, a plant-forward diet. Just in case you weren't here last week, some of the other recommendations include limiting consumption of sugar-sweetened drinks, as well as alcohol consumption, avoiding use of dietary supplements for the purpose of cancer prevention, and then for mothers, if you are able to nurse or breastfeed your baby, that does have some protective benefits for both mom and baby. And lastly, these recommendations apply to you whether you've never had a cancer diagnosis or are a cancer survivor and thriver. All right, so why are we talking about plant-based diets? So these diets, plant foods, help us to get enough food that provide fiber, micronutrients, and phytochemicals. So I touched on this a little bit last week, but we see some amazing research in the nutrition world that higher fiber diets are linked to decreased cancer risk. So unless you have some sort of abnormality in your GI system, it's recommended that women aim for 25 grams of fiber per day, and men aim for about 38 grams of fiber per day. We think that part of the reason for this is high fiber foods help us maintain that healthy body weight. They also support a healthy gut microbiome, and high fiber foods contain a ton of micronutrients and those cancer fighting phytochemicals. So we want to get an abundance of these nutrients through our diet to help us reduce risk of really all chronic disease, whether it's heart disease, Alzheimer's or dementia, type 2 diabetes. But of course, what we're here to talk about is our cancer risk. We know that increasing plant foods can also help us maintain or reach a healthy body weight. Part of that is because of the fiber, which keeps us full and satisfied. Also, part of it's just the caloric balance. These whole plant foods aren't having a ton of saturated fats added to them, sodium, added sugars, so on and so forth. So one thing I do want to clarify is that when we talk about plant-based diets on the next slide, we'll talk about different kinds of plant-based diets. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to give up all animal foods. So I like to use the word a plant-forward diet, meaning that plants are really the star of the show. They're the majority of what we're putting on our plate. When it comes to cancer risk, we're really not seeing a big benefit for being vegan or vegetarian versus someone who eats both animal and plant foods, as long as they're getting that fiber intake in, getting a variety of those nutrient dense plant foods. So, really, it's not always as much about cutting out the animal products as it is about adding in these plant foods. When we're consuming a ton of animal products, it can be really difficult to make sure we're getting enough of the plant foods that are recommended. Hey, so with plant-based diets, what are our options? So we have a couple. The first type of plant-based diet we're going to talk about is a flexitarian diet. So this is someone who primarily eats only plant foods. They will eat dairy, they will eat eggs, and they'll also eat small amounts of meat, fish, and seafood. Um, so essentially, every now and again, someone, maybe most of the week you're doing meatless meals, but maybe it's Friday night and you want to have a turkey burger out with your friends, they might have a turkey burger. But for the most part, meat isn't one of the things that's getting added to the grocery list every single week. Okay. Now we also have pescatarian diets. So this is someone who is going to be eating dairy foods, eggs, fish, and seafood, but no red meat and no poultry. So really thinking plants and fish. Then of course we have the vegetarian diet, typically including dairy foods and eggs, but no meat, no poultry, and no fish or seafood. I do want to say that there are distinctions within these categories. Some people might not do dairy or they might not do eggs or one or the other. But we're just kind of keeping it broad today, and know that you can individualize these diets however you would like. But lastly, we do have the vegan diet, which no animal foods or products whatsoever, whether that is your dairy or your eggs or even honey, since it's coming from a bee in many cases, or fish. We're strictly sticking to fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, so on and so forth. Okay. So the American Institute of Cancer Research has created a visual to help us picture what this plant-forward or plant-based diet would look like. So this picture here is going to show you that 2/3 or more of your plate should be those plant foods, leaving about a third or less of the plate if you're choosing to go vegetarian, vegan, so on, as your animal protein. So again, we're thinking about 2/3 of the plate or more being plant foods. Typically, what this is going to look like is a 3-ounce serving of meat, whether that's the fish or poultry or red meat, aiming for about 2 different kinds of vegetables because we want to focus on getting a variety of plant foods in the diet. So, not just an abundance, but also a variety because every plant food is going to have its own unique nutritional composition, including its own unique composition of those phytonutrients. So, we really want to give our body access to a library of those micronutrients. And then lastly, we want to make sure we have a healthy carbohydrate that, again, is high in fiber to help us reach that 25 grams a day or 38 grams a day. So this can usually look like a whole grain, Or it could look like something like a sweet potato that has the skin on it, or a starchy vegetable like green peas. Okay, so I love this slide because this kind of shows a gradual transition from a typical Western diet, which is what the majority of us eat here in the United States. So really thinking like a meat and potatoes diet, to that new American plant-forward plate. So you'll notice here on the left, we have a pretty big serving. I would probably call this a double serving of red meat in the form of steak, a large serving of mashed potatoes. So it's pretty white, so I'm guessing there's no skin in there. So we're probably cutting out most of the fiber from the potato. We have more animal products in the butter that's on the potatoes. And then we have a starchy vegetable with the green peas. So if this is a plate that looks similar to something you might eat or would regularly eat, I don't expect you to go from the left to the right picture right away. There are some steps we can take in the middle there to make this transition easier. So the first suggestion would be to cut back on the portion of the meat. So you see in the first picture, it's taking up about a third of the plate. And then in the middle photo, it's a much smaller portion. So you could either do a smaller portion or swap from a red meat to a lean meat. We've also switched from the starchy green pea vegetable to a non-starchy green bean vegetable, which is a wonderful option for those vitamins. And then instead of potatoes, we have added in brown rice, which is a whole grain. Okay, so this is a great step. So then we move on to the new American plate. So you'll see in this step, we did swap from a red meat to a poultry. So we're coming into compliance with that recommendation to limit red meats and avoid processed meats. We've gone from a brown, or maybe it's a white rice, to what looks like more of a whole grain medley. So maybe some quinoa and a rice mixture. And then instead of just having green beans, we've added a variety of vegetables to the plate. So in my opinion, this third picture is a little bit more appealing because you're kind of eating the rainbow, so to speak. You're getting a lot of good colors, a lot of good flavors. So this is kind of what transitioning to this plant-based plate could look like. And of course, there's a variety. There's different ways you could go about this, but I really like this visual. Okay, so let's talk about how to get started. So as we mentioned, we want to put plant foods first. This is supposed to be the star of the show, right? So that means, we want to think about the plant foods first before we even cook the meal and probably before we even do our grocery shopping for the week, right? Because if we don't have an abundance of plant foods in our pantry, it's not going to end up on our plate. So this comes, all the way to your meal prepping for the week when you're writing out your grocery list, deciding what you're cooking for you or the family. And we want to go ahead and think about those plant foods. We want to choose brightly colored or strongly flavored vegetables and fruits that you like and enjoy. Again, it's easier to eat healthy when we think our plate is beautiful or tastes good. I'm not going to tell you, if you love all vegetables except for broccoli, I'm not going to tell you to fill your plate with broccoli. There are a lot, many more opportunities for great plant foods that we could add in instead. If you are going to include some animal products, remember to keep that to about a third of the plate. We want it to be the supporting cast member of the production of your plate. And lastly, we also want to make sure we're filling our plate with mostly whole foods. So, things that have not been heavily processed. So fresh foods, frozen, and also canned can also be considered whole foods. But we're going to talk a little bit more about what a whole food versus a processed food is. So I like dictionary.com's definition of whole food, which is a food with little or no refining or processing and containing no artificial additives or preservatives. So, something like an apple that doesn't necessarily have a nutrition label on it because you know what's in an apple. They're not adding anything to it, right? On the other side of that, we get a processed food. It's a pretty lengthy definition by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They say that it's really any food product that's undergone any kind of handling, whether that's washing, cleaning, cutting, chopping, dehydrating, freezing, packaging. So for example, shredded carrots technically have been processed, but that's really getting into the nitty gritty. We know that a shredded carrot is still perfectly nutritious for us. So when I'm talking about whole foods versus processed foods, what I'm really referring to with a processed food is those that have had the addition of other ingredients, whether it's preservatives, flavoring, nutrients, or any kind of food additive. For example, salt, sugar, and fat. Okay. So here are some examples of some of those processed foods versus those whole foods. So I would say this is a good example for snacks. So we've got a couple things. We've got goldfish, we've got some peanut butter crackers, we have some potato chips. We know that there are probably things getting added to this, right? Like we know it's not a whole grain. They're adding some kind of flavor, some kind of sodium, maybe some sugar to the peanut butter and the crackers. So of course that's something that we would maybe want to be cautious of what's going in versus if we were doing something like a whole piece of fruit. Now, again, there are levels to it. So applesauce, for example, that could be one of those minimally processed foods where they're maybe not adding added sugar. It's just water and apples that they've just, cooked down or blended, or I'm not sure how applesauce is made. But, it's still going to have great nutrients in it. So some other examples of minimally processed foods where I'm not super concerned about what's going in it will be things like your bagged pre-washed spinach and lettuces, those cut up veggies and fruits, roasted nuts that have been prepackaged or maybe shelled, like shelled pistachios. That's technically minimally processed. I also like to note that sometimes minimally processed foods have been processed at their peak point and nutritional value. And then they're either frozen or canned to lock in those great nutrients. So sometimes if fresh produce isn't an option, maybe the grocery store near you, you feel like the produce is going bad really quickly, or you feel like your household can't keep up with eating the produce that you purchase. Frozen and canned can be a really helpful tool in your nutrition tool belt. Now, of course, more heavily processed foods are more of the ready to eat foods. So those granola bars, the goldfish and the potato chips and crackers we just saw. And then also things like deli meat, that have been cured, they've had sodium added, they might have nitrites in them as a preservative. And then lastly, we have our most heavily processed foods that are things like pre-made meals, like frozen pizza, microwavable dinners, boxed, pasta dishes, things of that nature. Those are the foods that we really want to make sure we're not eating too often. And of course, we always want to use that nutrition facts label to look out for sneaky things like added sugars and sodium. So just a reminder that a plate that regularly contains fried foods, sweets, and other highly processed foods is not a healthy option, even if it is a plant food. For example, French fries. No, there's a usually heavily salted, cooked in oil, they're fried food, right? But they do come from a potato. Well, the fact that it's been heavily processed is definitely outweighing any nutrients that the potato maybe was providing. So just keep that in mind. This applies to things like baked goods. They're technically coming from plants, from wheat, chips, crackers, so on and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about some strategies for meal planning and give some good examples here. So we talked about the New American Plate, which is one really excellent visual, but I also really like to rely on what we call the plate method. So some of you all, I recognize your names, you've worked with me, you maybe know that we like to go through the plate method, and it really can be such a helpful tool. So, what it is it's a way of making sure we're balancing our nutrients without necessarily having to get into the nitty gritty of calculating every calorie or every macronutrient that you're putting on your plate. In a perfect world, the plate method would consist of half of a plate of non starchy vegetables, a quarter of a plate of protein, and a quarter of a plate a high fiber carbohydrate, so your grains and your starches. So we'll keep this in mind. We're going to go through each of these food groups and give some examples of foods that fall into each category. But I'm also going to give a sample one-day menu, and we'll kind of look and see how we put all the pieces together to follow this plate method. All right, so we're going to kick it off with those non-starchy vegetables since we really want plant foods to be the star of the show. So for fruit and vegetable intake, best practice is to eat 5 to 7 servings of fruits and vegetables each day, starting with about 4 servings of these non-starchy vegetables. Now, if that seems like an exorbitant number to you, if that feels so lofty, that is okay. And it's absolutely normal considering when we looked at the Western plate a couple of slides ago, if we follow that diet, it's going to be really hard to get 4 servings a day of non-starchy vegetables. We're certainly not alone. Our food system is not currently set up to make this easier for everyone. So setting smaller goals and working towards this is what counts. Okay, so a serving is going to be 1 cup of raw leafy vegetables, so something like your spinach, your romaine, your kale, or a half cup of cooked or raw non-leafy vegetables. So some examples of the non-starchy are things like cucumbers, bell pepper, cauliflower, broccoli, all those good leafy greens, asparagus, so on and so forth. You'll see here there are tons of options. So if someone tells me, hey, I'm just not a big vegetable eater, I like to pull this list up and go, okay, let's look at which ones you haven't tried. And maybe there's an opportunity for us to find a new favorite vegetable. Okay. Now let's shift gears and talk about lean protein. So on this slide, I'm highlighting some anti-inflammatory plant-based protein choices. So when we look at that plate method, the example there was a piece of meat. But when we're talking about plant-based diets, it's still important that we're getting quality protein, even if it's coming from plant foods. Now, if you are eating meat, we still recommend aiming for about 3 to 4 servings of these plant-based choices each week. And a serving is about half of a cup of cooked insert food. So beans, lentils, tofu, edamame, so on and so forth. A tip I like to give is we know that most of these plant-based protein options won't give you as much protein bang for your buck as like a piece of chicken would. So what I recommend is aiming for 2 different plant-based sources of protein at your meal if that's the route you're going to choose. So if you're building a beautiful salad, maybe we're sprinkling some nuts on top for a little protein, and maybe we're adding a half cup of chickpeas or edamame or white beans to the salad to round it out with the second protein option. So I get a couple questions about some vegetarian protein sources when I'm working with patients. The first one is people say, well, I would love to eat beans. They taste great, but I feel like they cause gas. In most folks, legumes themselves cause an increase in gas. What typically happens is if we have a chronically low fiber diet and we introduce a high fiber food like a legume into our diet, yeah, it might cause a little bit of discomfort. But what research shows, and also experience working with clients, has shown me that over about a 2-month period of time, slowly introducing legumes and also just overall increasing fiber at a slow rate helps to reduce the amount of gas that's produced. It helps your body tolerate this greater amount of fiber. The second question I get asked is, will I become iron deficient if I don't eat meat? Maybe you went through cancer treatment and your hemoglobin is low, and your physicians are worried about your iron status, or maybe you've been diagnosed already as anemic. So there's not a separate iron requirement for vegetarians compared to meat eaters, but you do have to think a little bit more to make sure you're adding in those vegetarian sources of iron into the diet. So, for example, lentils are one of the highest sources of iron in a plant food. So, making sure we're incorporating something like that a couple times a week could help you to slowly increase your iron. Consuming foods rich in vitamin C, which many of the fruits and vegetables we're talking about contain vitamin C, will also help your body utilize and absorb that iron better. On the opposite side of things, we want to make sure that we're separating either our iron-rich meals or our iron supplements from calcium supplements, because calcium reduces how well your body absorbs iron. And same thing with coffee and tea. They have a phytonutrient in them called tannins that can also interfere with iron absorption. So maybe separate your coffee and your tea time from those vitamin C and iron-rich meals. And that will hopefully be, one good step in helping you maintain your iron levels. Okay. Now, we do have some other anti-inflammatory protein choices that contain omega-3 fatty acids, so a heart-healthy fatty acid. This is primarily going to come from our servings of fish. So a serving of fish is 3 to 4 ounces cooked. And we recommend, this is 3 to 4 servings, and I did write that, but really I think about 2 servings if you're getting omega-3s from other sources of food as well is probably sufficient. And we'll talk about some of those other healthy fat sources in just a moment. Now, we do have some other lean protein sources. So these are things that they're not necessarily anti-inflammatory, but they're also not pro-inflammatory. That's going to be your poultry. It's going to be things like a veggie burger, like a black bean burger, for example, maybe a protein powder, like a whey protein isolate, and egg white. Now, some foods that we recommend eating less frequently because they might be pro-inflammatory are going to be shellfish, so your crab, shrimp, scallops, etc. Your egg yolks. Right now, we're recommending as many egg whites as you want, but 3 to 4 egg yolks per week. And then, of course, minimizing that red meat intake and choosing the lower fat cuts if you are going to consume red meat. And of course, in order to be in compliance with that recommendation, we want to avoid as many processed meats as we can. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk now about whole grains. So whole grains are less processed than refined grains. So the word is in the name, right? It's whole. The whole plant has been left intact. So you're getting more fiber, a lot more B vitamins and other nutrients in a whole grain product than a processed grain or refined grain like white bread, and white pasta. We want to aim for about 3 servings of whole grains per day. That's usually about half of a cup of cooked whole grains or something like 1 slice of whole grain bread. Some other examples of whole grains are going to be things like quinoa, oatmeal, brown rice, wild rice, and then some that I see less often, but things like buckwheat and spelt. There are also some good whole grain products and some other starchy vegetables that we can round out that carbohydrate section of the plate method. So things like brown rice cakes, 100% whole wheat bread products like an English muffin or a small bagel, whole grain noodles and pasta. Popcorn is actually a whole grain, so that's a great snack option. And then, of course, we have our starchy vegetables, so things like pumpkin, winter squashes, our potatoes and yams. Corn is also a starchy vegetable, green peas. All of those fit into this category. Okay, so what about dairy and dairy alternatives? So, of course, depending on your level of plant-based diet, you may or may not choose to consume dairy products. Dairy is considered a great source of protein, as well as calcium and vitamin D. So, right now, it's recommended to get 2 to 3 servings per day. Now, it is possible to be dairy-free and still get plenty of calcium and protein in the diet. But again, similar to iron, you just have to be a lot more intentional about it. We do recommend choosing low-fat or non-fat dairy for most folks because if we're getting 2 to 3 servings and they're full fat, whole milk based, it can add up in those saturated fats, which are the less heart healthy kind of fat. If you're lactose intolerant, the good news is there's a ton of calcium fortified plant-based milks out there on the market. But again, you want to look for calcium fortified because something like an oat milk or an almond milk or a coconut milk, those have to have the calcium added to it. Same with the vitamin D. They don't naturally have that in. They also don't naturally have very much, if any, protein in them. A great alternative that I recommend for my lactose-free or dairy-free folks is soy milk. Soy is naturally high in protein. It naturally has calcium, although they often fortify it with more. They also make sure it's fortified with vitamin C. And as you'll remember last week when we talked about busting some nutrition myths, soy does not increase the risk of cancer. And in some cases, specifically breast cancer, the most up-to-date research tells us we think it actually has a protective benefit against cancer. So a serving of dairy products is usually 1 cup for milk and about 1 cup for yogurt or 1 ounce of hard cheese. Okay, so next we have fruits. So of course, fruits are a fan favorite, naturally sweet plant food. They're high in vitamin C, that great fiber, specifically if they have skin on them or seeds like the skin of an apple or the seeds and berries. And they are chock full of phytonutrients. When they're in season, I recommend choosing fresh so you get them at their peak ripeness. Or if you're buying them out of season, go ahead and get them frozen as long as there's no syrup or added sugar. That way you get, again, the maximum amount of nutritional benefit. We recommend avoiding drinking fruit juices because they can add up in calories and sugar. And of course, you're missing out on some of those micronutrients and all of that fiber if you're getting your fruit from fruit juice. The dietary guidelines for Americans recommends that you can have one of your servings of fruit a day as fruit juice, but it's only a 4-ounce serving. So usually we're having at least 8 ounces. So to get to that 5 to 7 servings of fruits and vegetables, you remember we're aiming for about 4 servings or more of non-starchy vegetables. And so to get to 7, that's going to be 2 to 3 servings of fruit per day. That's usually about a medium whole piece of fruit or about half of a banana or 1 cup of cut up raw fruits. Okay. So I believe this is last on our foray into the foods that make up the plate method. So we have healthy fats. These are unsaturated fats that have either omega-3 or omega-6 fatty acids, which again, I mentioned earlier, are anti-inflammatory, heart healthy, and also healthy for brain aging, mental health, and again, cancer prevention. These fats are very necessary for our body to produce hormones, as well as transport vitamins and help build healthy new cells. So we don't want to skimp out on these. Some examples are going to be really any of the nuts, almonds, cashews, hazelnuts, pistachios, seeds, things like flaxseed, pumpkin seeds, or oils, so vegetable-based oils, things like avocado oil, olive oil are two of the best oils that I recommend. Nuts and nut butters have the added benefit of also being a lean protein. So you're getting kind of a triple whammy with nuts. You're getting some healthy fat, you're getting some fiber, and you're getting some protein. Okay. So, some meal planning tips now that we've gone through each of the food groups. We want to be creative. So, if your family is just starting off and you want to make it fun and appealing to eat plant based, I recommend following themes. The classic is Meatless Monday, but you could do Plant Based Taco Tuesday. I think our next cooking demo here at the Cancer Support Community with Chef Mike is he's doing jackfruit tacos, so some plant based tacos. That's a great idea. Or you could do lentil tacos or black bean tacos. You could do something like a Noodle Wednesday where maybe you make some kind of soup that has noodles and lots of vegetables in it. You really, the sky's the limit here. You can be creative. You could also print off or make your own weekly meal plans to kind of write out what you think you're going to have throughout the week so you can grocery shop and prep in advance and know what you're going to have. Okay. Some other tips to help reach that 5 to 7 servings a day of fruits and vegetables. It's a good idea to start with breakfast. Now, I'm not going to argue breakfast is the most important meal of the day, but it can really set your day up for success and make or break some diets. I like to start off my breakfast with a really high fiber punch. So I like to do a meal and top it with walnuts for that, again, that whammy of fiber, healthy fats and protein, and then some kind of berry to help make sure I'm going ahead and starting my day with a serving of fruit. It can be really hard to reach 5 to 7 servings if we're not including any kind of fruit or vegetable at breakfast. Again, we want to make sure we're not skimping on protein. We want to incorporate that with every meal. So whether that's including seafood twice a week, so maybe we do salmon one night, maybe tuna salad another day. Trying to have a meatless meal with some kind of plant-based protein. So maybe we're experimenting with tofu or we're making a lentil soup. And then again, we want to make sure we're really avoiding those processed meats and trying to limit red meats whenever we can. Another tip is to use snacks to your advantage. This can be a place where people say, Savannah, I'm so good at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but then my after work snack, I go hog wild and I eat whatever I can get my hands on. That's very common, and that can certainly set us off our path. It can make the weight management a lot harder if we're getting a lot of heavily processed snack foods in. So this is another great opportunity to get some plant foods in. Maybe we're swapping to that whole grain popcorn, or maybe we're gonna try dipping bell pepper into hummus or guacamole, or doing edamame as a crunchy snack. There's really a lot of opportunities to play around with snack time and make sure that you're nourishing your body and really, benefiting it. So I'm not anti-snacks, but we just want to do them well. Okay, so as promised, I want to walk through a sample menu of following the plate method. So on this day, and I didn't make this using any sort of calorie or protein range, it's really just more of a general idea. For breakfast, we start off with a serving of protein and a dairy product with the fat-free Greek yogurt. I topped it with 1.5 fruit servings with a kiwi, so that medium whole fruit, and 1/4 of a cup of mango, and 1 ounce of chopped cashews for that healthy fat and protein. For snack, I did some whole grain pita and hummus. So we're getting our first whole grain of the day. And then for lunch, we're getting our second whole grain with a black bean and quinoa chili. So our protein here is both the black beans and also quinoa, which is a whole grain that happens to have some protein. And of course, it wouldn't be chili if we weren't loading it down with things like onion, tomato, garlic, making sure we're getting lots of vegetables in there. And then for dinner on this day, I did 3 to 4 ounces of salmon fillet. So if you're a pescatarian or choose to eat seafood, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, this could easily be something like a tofu or tempeh. Then we did 1 to 1.5 cups of roasted Brussels sprouts and carrots, roasted in olive oil so that we also get a little bit of a healthy fat. So again, similar to the New American plate, we're making sure to get 2 different kinds of vegetables on this plate. And then lastly, we got our third serving of whole grain with wild rice. Now, if it's the end of the day and maybe you feel like, you didn't meet your fruit and vegetable quota, a great dessert would be something like strawberries. It's Valentine's Day week, so that's a popular one, maybe with a little piece of dark chocolate or something like that. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of what putting this in practice would look like. So especially with the quinoa chili, you'll see it doesn't have to be this plate that's sectioned out. We can follow the plate method in a casserole or in a soup, and still really make sure that we're adhering to those principles. Okay, so I did throw up some extra snack ideas for you all. I won't go through them individually. Feel free to take a picture, or you can look back at the recording when this goes out. But things like a trail mix, or peanut butter and fruit, or Greek yogurt with berries, string cheese, a hard-boiled egg, so on and so forth. Really focusing on those whole, minimally processed foods. Okay. So some additional tips, make sure you're eating more of the plant foods that you already like. As I mentioned earlier, it's not going to be sustainable if you're forcing yourself to eat all these foods that you don't really like. So a great first step is just increasing the quantity of those foods that you know are really good for you. So a great starting point, if you like fruit but you're only getting it once a day, try upping that to a couple of times a day. Okay. Also, don't feel like you have to replace or eliminate the animal foods um, that you really like immediately. Start off by cutting out the ones that maybe you're not the biggest fan of or you could kind of do without. That's a great place to start. And then for those foods that you're hesitant to give up, you can just start by monitoring the portion size, cutting it in half like we did on that New American plate, and then shifting the focus to the plant foods on the plate. A great example of pizza, everyone loves, well, not everyone, but a lot of people love a pepperoni pizza. So you could start off, you could switch that from a pepperoni pizza to a veggie pizza, or instead of only eating pizza, keep it to 1 to 2 slices and instead add a large side salad. Another tip, don't be afraid to experiment with new things if it's within the budget. Um, I'm newer to tofu, honestly, and I'm still getting the hang of it. But it's fun and it's fun to mix things up. So don't be afraid to try and don't be afraid to fail either.
Savannah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
How do you feel about like Beyond Meat and Impossible Meat, those plant-based meats that you can buy? Are those okay?
Yeah, that's a good question. So okay, a lot of those products are made with something called soy protein isolate, which is derived from soy, which we established last week. Soy is safe for us. But what we haven't studied as much is the soy protein isolate. So as far as soy being safe in that form, we don't have the best data yet to really determine that when it comes to cancer risk. But what I will say about those products is they're heavily processed. So they do fall into that heavily processed category where they often are adding a lot of saturated fat and they're adding a lot of sodium to them to make it taste good and to make it taste like meat. So personally, I would prefer to eat the whole food version. So something like a whole black bean, burger or pinto bean burger versus something like the Beyond Burger or even, the faux chicken nuggets and those sorts of products. So that's my concern there. I think having it every now and again, I don't anticipate it being necessarily carcinogenic, the soy protein isolates, but I would just recommend really reading that nutrition label and making sure everything on that label aligns with your health goals. So if you need to be watching sodium, look out for that sort of thing, just like you would any other processed food.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Couple other tips, and then we'll dive into some more questions here in a second. Where did I leave off? Okay, make sure you're stocking your kitchen. Keep it prepped with things that are easy to throw together. Some staples that I like to keep are like microwavable quinoa or brown rice for when I'm really in a pinch. I don't have time to whip up, some elaborate meal. I can, microwave some quinoa. I'll add some black beans, toss on, some salsa, maybe whatever vegetables I have, and I have like a little whole grain burrito bowl. Some other things to keep on hand are going to be, again, those frozen fruits and vegetables. Nuts and seeds tend to have a long shelf life. Drier canned beans, those are all excellent options to keep stocked up. Okay, so if you're looking for recipe inspiration, of course, I'm going to recommend the American Institute of Cancer Research. My dietetic intern pointed out today that they have some recipes that were created or suggested by cancer survivors. So I think that's a really nice touch that they have. They have a lot of really delicious looking recipes on there. Cookforyourlife.org is another great resource for recipes. And if you're a survivor, you're just coming off of treatment, you can filter recipes by some of your symptoms. So if you're looking for foods that are good for when you're nauseous, you can filter through that and it'll give you some good ideas. And then oncologynutrition.org also has some great recipe ideas to get you started. Okay, so this week, I'm going to challenge everyone, myself included, so you can keep me accountable next week to try at least one new plant-based recipe. And again, we want to make sure we're not skimping out on that protein. We want to follow that plate method as much as we can. So make sure it has that source of protein, whether it's the lentils, the nuts, seeds, beans, etc. So I hope that you guys have fun with this. Maybe we'll have some good stories. But now what I'd love to do is move into our question time. So feel free to pop questions in the chat. If you did experiment with the challenge last week, go ahead and feel free to share that. I'll share mine real quick. So one of the challenges was, reducing sugar sweetened beverages and alcohol consumption, whether by trying a mocktail or increasing water intake. So one thing that I did that made a big difference is this water bottle. So I'm not following my own tip today, but this water bottle I poured a drink, and the one I used last week had a straw, and that actually really helped me to drink a lot more water and stay hydrated throughout the day. So then I wasn't, craving like a sweet beverage or something else. So that was what I did, but feel free to pop it in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and read any questions that we have. And then we can also unmute ourselves and ask as well, if that's your preference. Okay. So I'm going to scroll down. Okay, so the great question about the Beyond Meat and the Impossible Burger, so we answered that. Wonderful. Lauren put in a flyer for the lunch with Chef Mike, so those tacos we talked about. Okay, what about plant-based meal replacement powders like Shakeology? So I'm not super familiar with Shakeology, the brand itself, but I'm guessing this is referring to like those pre-made protein shakes. So things that are maybe made with the whey protein isolates. So those are going to be processed, and sometimes they are adding a lot of sugar to them, sometimes not so much. I do think they can be a helpful tool in the tool belt, especially if you are just now coming off of cancer treatment. Maybe if you've lost weight or lost muscle mass, your appetite is decreased and you're struggling to get enough calories in. Or maybe you're a busy parent and you're working and you're in the car all day, and sometimes you skip meals or are tempted to run through the drive-through because you don't have time to make a meal. That's when I think those shakes can be really beneficial, because I'd rather you get something, some sort of nutrition, and at least you're getting some protein in there than nothing. But with that said, there are some brands I think are better than others. I'm partial to the brand Only What You Need. So OWYN, it's plant-based and it's really compiled of like a lot of whole foods. But there are some other products in the market that might work for your needs a little bit better than that. Okay, Christine loves Skinny Pop. Is that okay to eat? Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Again, popcorn is a whole grain. Just be careful of like the flavorings or how much they're adding to it. Regular popped popcorn, so not flavored, not adding a lot of butter or anything to it, a serving is about 3.5 cups, which is a pretty big serving. Versus potato chips, you get like 12 potato chips. So I think it's a great snack option if you just feel like you have the munchies, you just want something crunchy. Absolutely, that can be part of a healthy diet. Smoothies can also absolutely be part of a healthy diet, especially if we're following the plate method within our smoothie. So making sure we're having a protein, not doing too much fruit. I recommend limiting to about 1 cup of fruit in a smoothie. They're a great way to sneak in some greens. You can pop your chia seeds or your flax seeds in them. So it's a great way to get a lot of bang for your buck nutrient wise. Okay. Okay, so Melissa's getting back to us. She looked into the Beyond Meat, said it doesn't have any soy. They use pea protein. Okay, and that's another plant-based protein option. It is also still heavily processed. So my thought would be there, maybe don't worry about the soy as much, but again, just look out for all the other additives that they're putting in there. You'll notice there's a lot of ingredients in those that you probably can't pronounce. That's going to fall into that heavily processed category. So just be cautious of some of that. Okay. The last question we have in the chat, but again, feel free to pop more in, or we still have a couple minutes, so you can also unmute yourself. Is someone has read that we shouldn't eat farm raised fish, but they prefer the taste of farm raised versus wild caught. So fish is really something I have a hard time taking a stance on, because we know that there are some issues with our sustainability and the practices of raising fish, or even natural caught fish, wild caught fish. There are some issues. Some people have concerns over things like the mercury content in them, and that's not something to take lightly. With that said, with the data we still have on fish intake, is still pointing to it being more beneficial to avoiding it because of how it was raised or the potential mercury. Now, mercury is a concern. There are certain fish that have lower levels of mercury that I would recommend. I believe salmon is one of those that's lower. I think tuna is moderate in mercury. So you could do a little bit of a dive into that. But truthfully, I would recommend whichever one you prefer that's going to help you get your omega-3 fatty acids in. I think that's really what the science is showing has the most benefit on our overall health, not just cancer risk, but also, heart health and just an overall anti-inflammatory lifestyle. So that's a great question. I'm sorry I couldn't give you a solid answer on that. That's really up to personal preference. Okay, any other questions? Does anyone else want to unmute themselves and have anything they want to share and add before we sign off for the day? Okay, it sounds like we are all set. I know I breezed through this. We previously had these set for an hour and a half, and we shortened them to an hour, but it's all the same great information, but I apologize if I talked quickly. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. I really love this talk. I hope to see you all next week as we talk about evaluating some of the research. So when you're offline, where we don't have these sessions and you're wondering about some of these questions you're asking, hopefully we have a little bit more confidence in finding some of those answers.
Thank you for joining Cancer Support Community Atlanta for this program. If you're interested in other live or recorded programs, please visit the online program tab of our website, cscatlanta.org, or follow us on Facebook. We'll be sharing additional information on upcoming programs.